Elon Musk at Elon Musk. Elon Musk says the blue checkmark system is, quote, bullshit, and Twitter Blue will be $8 per month with half the ads, priority in replies, mentions and search, and more. I'm going to try and speed run a little bit here, not spend quite as much time as I have in the past, if for no other reason than personally running a little behind schedule. There's a lot to say about the notion of verification being purchased as opposed to earned. There's a lot to say about what it means to have priority in replies or in mentions or in search. I think the most relevant thing here is who TechMeme is sourcing. It's Elon, directly. Someone wrote this headline because that's clearly not how Elon tweets in the third person. That's not a thing. But there's no external source that's being pointed to here. That's what's relevant. That's what's powerful. Again, go back to 2016 when the President of the United States did most of their public communication using Twitter, communicating directly to one's audience is a powerful thing. It's part of what makes Twitter highly useful, valuable even. And the notion that the person that owns the business is now going to communicate directly about how the business will evolve over time, that's an important thing. Tom Warren, The Verge. Sony plans to launch the PlayStation VR 2 on February 22nd for $550, 530 Great British pounds, or 600 euros. Pre-orders open November 15th. This will certainly be an exciting one to watch. There aren't that many players in the business of building state-of-the-art goggles to provide immersive experiences. We saw Meta's announcement. Their device is $1,500. Sony's device is literally $1,000 cheaper. One of them certainly lives closer toward the general computing device end of the spectrum, while the other one, the appliance end of the spectrum. And I think it'll be worthwhile to have some competition there because it will spur the development community to do different things, to try different things, because there will be two relatively distinct groups of users and potential customers for what they're going to build. So bring it on, Sony. Let's see what you got. New York Times. Twitter's chief customer officer, Sarah Personet, resigns. Sources say ad company IPG recommended that clients pause Twitter spending over moderation concerns. Related, Callie Hayes, insider. Comedian and verified Twitter user Tim Heidecker puts the site's moderation practices to the test by starting hashtag Trump is dead, which began trending on November 1st. Also related, Taylor Hallmaker, TechCrunch. Elon Musk's history of amplifying misinformation shows that his Twitter won't be interested in protecting the LGBTQ community and others facing targeted abuse. Advertising agencies recommending that their clients pause spending on Twitter. Of course, this was bound to happen. What's the adage about advertising? 50% of your ad spend is useless. Problem is determining which 50% that is. What the value, and the birds are really going at it this morning, what the value of ad spend on Twitter has been, I don't know. I'm not going to speculate, but it's not surprising that another C-suite executive has left the company, and that at least one advertising agency, if you consider that to be indicative of the advertising industry as a whole, has recommended its clients not continue to invest in placement on Twitter in the way that they have. All they're doing is reacting to uncertainty. These related stories, Heidecker's Trump is dead hashtag, and the notion that Elon's behavior in public as an individual are somehow indicative of what the content moderation at Twitter will be going forward. I just think both of these things are woefully early to the party. And I won't speculate as to why, although for a professional comedian to say something bombastic in public and then to bind that statement to what much of the public market is talking about right now, I think there's a pretty strong economic correlation there. So good on you, Tim. Do what you do. In terms of Elon's past history pointing to a lack of concern for the issues that are pertinent to the LGBTQ community, again, super early. Under Twitter's past leadership, there have been a myriad of issues in protecting the public respect of various groups and communities, not least of which is the LGBTQ community. So the notion that because there's a significant change in ownership and that the owner has a history of amplifying ideas which some people consider to be misinformation. I hate to say it, I've got news for everybody. Misinformation is not a natural law. There are some areas where it is extraordinarily clear-cut and easy to determine, and there are others where it's not. And that's the world we live in. And I'm not sure there's a whole lot else worth saying there. How am I doing on time? I have time for one more. Washington Post, internal email. Twitter appears to be rushing out a high-risk paywalled video feature, letting users charge to view their videos, with Twitter taking a cut. I sort of file this under most of the movements on Twitter Blue, or at least the communicated movements on Twitter Blue. This is exactly the sort of experimentation in the product that should have been happening for years. Paywalling content is not an especially new idea. You can look at the rest of the industry and see a variety of instances where users have to pay in order to get access to content. And those businesses run the moral and ethical gamut from OnlyFans to the New York Times. So the notion that Twitter doing it is somehow intrinsically high risk, I just don't buy it. Like, it doesn't hold water. Does Twitter have a much higher incidence of explicit, potentially harmful, potentially toxic content? Absolutely, more so than the New York Times. The New York Times, whatever your opinion is about the veracity of that institution, has a century of built up muscle around moderating the content which it publishes. Twitter has, at best, 15 years of that. And something tells me, if we go find the books which have been written about the company, or we wait a little while longer to read the books that will be written about the company, we're going to find that the notion of a cohesive, grounded in principle content moderation strategy within Twitter, the business, it's not that old. So, yeah, there's a higher quotient of content of concern on the platform. Does moving to high definition video represent potentially greater risk than text? Yes, absolutely. Facebook has been through this before. Other platforms have been through this before. It's horrific when human beings choose to amplify our worst behaviors and our worst impulses. But the notion that that's existential to operating a successful business, which provides a platform on which people can publish their ideas, reprehensible or not. Again, that's a spectrum. It's not a binary. I don't think Twitter's at any greater risk for exploring this feature. Time for a set. Naomi Nix, Washington Post. Elon says Twitter will not reinstate banned accounts until we have a clear process for doing so, which will take at least a few more weeks. Again, I think it's worth pointing out the meta-narrative here. This piece of news is being reported by the Washington Post. I haven't looked, but something tells me the majority of the original source material, which the Washington Post is citing in order to report this as news, is a tweet directly from Elon. That is, in some sense, the sort of real existential threat here. It's not to Twitter, it's to a lot of traditional media. The Washington Post being able to report this story is a small and, when viewed in isolation, inconsequential instance of the Washington Post business model, which is, you want to come to our property to read this story, at which point we may get you to read other stories. And in so doing, we can display advertising which we have sold the space for, and or encourage you to become a paying subscriber, a patron of the agency. And in a world where the people who, to use a sort of loaded adage, make the news. People who are doing things in the world about which traditional media organizations report on, when they can communicate directly to anybody on earth at exactly the same moment in time, the necessity of the traditional news agency, the traditional media organization, decreases. Not by a lot. The sky's not falling. We're still going to have newspapers. But what those newspapers consist of is going to continue to change. That's enough of the meta-narrative. Personally, I think this is the right move. There are no relitigations of the decision to ban accounts until there's a process which can be communicated in a way that most people can understand, or I should say many people can understand. That's, quite frankly, it's the bigger hill to climb, which is get to a content moderation policy which is rooted in principle, which can be clearly communicated, which can be enforced with consistency, and which has a mechanism for revisiting and revising over time. That's a bigger mountain to climb than how do we enable a greater number of well-meaning users to opt in to account verification. We put a reasonable fee on the process of account verification. Nilay Patel borrowed the phrase which at least I first heard from Scott Galloway. This is TSA pre-check. This is, you live in the United States, you're not an agent of violence and chaos, and you get on airplanes a lot. You may well be willing to spend a little bit of money, maybe it's on an annual basis, in order to have a superior experience getting from stepping onto the curb in front of the airport to boarding the plane. That's a product. It exists in the world. Is there a case to be made that like the floor of that experience should not go down too far? Another thing Nilay mentioned in the dedicated Vergecast episode last week about this deal having closed was allegedly Ryanair, the budget airline, I think based out of Ireland originally, don't quote me on that, explored having a area on the plane where you couldn't sit down, where there was like a cushion that you could lean on and a handrail you could hold on to, but that it was cheaper. And is there a place for, sort of ethical or moral outrage at the notion that an airline would allow you to fly on the plane without giving you a seat? Maybe. I also know that buses, trains, they have standing room. The metro transit system in Paris, the MTA in New York City, people stand on those trains all the time. Do those vehicles have different safety records than airplanes? Maybe. Again, getting into the weeds at that point. I don't think there's too much worth saying here. Yes, we're going to have to wait and see on what the content moderation policy is. And until such time as they're prepared to share that, revisiting accounts which were banned under the previous policy doesn't make any sense. Chelsea Cox, CNBC, FinCEN, U.S. financial firms processed around $1.2 billion in likely ransomware payments in 2021, up almost 3x year over year. Around 75% of H2 2021 ransomware incidents were linked to Russia. Don't pay the ransom, just don't do it. Consider the information loss, the cost of learning a very hard lesson, and then go harden your own systems. Karen Howe, Wall Street Journal. China's Zhengzhou Industrial Park, where Foxconn makes iPhones, begins a week-long lockdown to counteract the severe and complicated spread of COVID-19. We touched on this story the other day. This is horrific because, as this story no doubt describes, these are human beings being forced to stay in a place against their will. And I don't know, but it absolutely would not surprise me if force is being used to coerce them to stay in place. The most that I think any of us can hope for is that businesses like Apple will continue to work hard and fast to diversify where they do business such that some pressure can be put on Foxconn, if not the Chinese government, to treat its people with more humanity. Sergey Galan, bleeping computer. Dropbox says hackers stole code and some API keys from 130 GitHub repositories via a phishing campaign, but its core apps and infrastructure were unaffected. This is an interesting story that we could spend time on if it weren't a bit of a speed run day. Dropbox reports that GitHub repositories were compromised. My reading of that makes it sound as though the arguably ultimate cause of data housed by GitHub getting out into the open is Dropbox's fault. It's GitHub's problem, let's be clear, but it's Dropbox's fault. It's technically also Dropbox's problem. That's really interesting. And again, we're at a different day. We'd spend more time on it, but it's time for another set. Wall Street Journal. Netflix begins rolling out its basic with ads tier. Sources say licensing negotiations with Disney, Comcast, Sony, Warner Brothers, and Lionsgate are ongoing. It was bound to happen. Negotiations for content being ongoing is it's a strange way to say Netflix is bleeding if the things you want to watch are not things Netflix can provide to you. Are you as motivated to continue to be a Netflix customer? Disney arguably has zero motivation to license its content to Netflix. Comcast, Sony, Warner Brothers, Lionsgate, they're not rolling their own direct-to-consumer offering. So maybe they'd rather license their content to Disney. They'd rather license their content to Paramount. Like, stranger things have happened. There was a time when Warner Brothers owned AOL, NBC, Universal. Like, media companies merge and break apart all the time. So maybe Netflix is the safest harbor for a lot of those businesses, but I don't know. We'll see. Chris Welch, The Verge, Apple TV 4K 2022 review. Affordable, snappy performance and USB-C remote, but no AirTag-like remote tracking, lackluster live TV, and somewhat stale design. I don't think there's a lot to say about Apple's set-top box device. Quite frankly, I feel like they've never been in a better position to actually build their own large panel. They have strong enough relationships with panel manufacturers for all the other things they sell that, use display panels. And if they owned the device, then they're no longer in the which HDMI input is our experience battle, which every other television appliance maker is in. They get to elevate themselves away from that. I don't know why Amazon hasn't started selling their own television, for God's sake. TCL and Roku appear to be merging tighter and tighter together, but all those things are sort of future casting. Many people have said this before me. The USB-C connector being on the remote definitely would indicate that the next iPhone is going to have USB-C. And Greg Joswiak put on an exceptional performance with the Wall Street Journal and Joanna Stern when he complained about being compelled to do this. But let's face facts, it's a better connector. It's the connector everyone else uses. It's not perfect. I bought a kitchen scale just the other day that uses USB-C to charge, except that it won't charge over an Anchor USB-C cable, and it won't charge over an Apple USB-C cable. So don't get me wrong, we're very much not out of the woods yet on this nonsense, but Apple moving in the right direction is a good thing. Yulim Lee Bloomberg, Sydney-based Blackbird raised an Australian dollars $1 billion plus fund, the largest Australian VC fund yet, including 284 million Australian dollars for early stage in Australia and 668 million Australian dollars for follow-on bets. Living in the United States, being born and raised in Silicon Valley, it can often appear as though the venture industry is a very California-centric or America-centric industry. It wouldn't surprise me if we go look at the data. Historically, that's accurate. But this is a good thing. There are regional differences between groups of human beings, and to the extent that we want all of those groups of people to be able to participate in the engine of economic progress and human prosperity that is the technology economy. That was a whole lot of words. We should have healthy venture industries in as many nations as we can get them. So good on you, Aussies. Keep it going. She'll be right. Financial Times. The UK's Ofcom begins scrapping legislation compelling BT and KCOM to provide affordable, dedicated landlines, sounding the death knell for the fax machine. I had to fax something yesterday, and let me tell you, it is barbaric. The idea that landlines are dying fills me with happiness, if for no other reason than I personally believe it's time for us to move away from a string of digits being the most popular common address to reach a human being with a piece of communication. So, awesome. Keep going. Laura Coladoni, CNBC. Sources: Twitter managers told employees they would be paid for their newly vested shares in the first half of November 2022, starting as early as November 4. You got to pay out people whose compensation was based on options or public equities which no longer exist or are no longer applicable, respectively. So, yeah, like this will be an important story to keep track of because Elon, according to many people, has a history of doing everything he can to compensate people who he no longer views as performant as conservatively as possible. There are stories floating around about how people who have already been let go of Twitter were described as being let go for performance reasons, and that the justification for using that language is that it provides legal defense for the company in the event that any of those employees sue for wrongful termination. So somebody, I'm glad, is paying attention to that story because there's some accountability work that needs to get done. Addie Robertson, The Verge. Tumblr updates its community guidelines to allow nudity, mature subject matter, and sexual themes, but says sexually explicit acts remain off limits. Trying to thread the needle on what sort of sexually explicit material can be put on the internet is not easy. Tumblr has a history of being a place for sexually explicit material, and so maybe there's some way to do that which is sort of defensible and sustainable. I don't know. And I'm not going to spend a lot more time thinking about it because I'm not in that market. Washington Post. Sources: the U.S. is exploring whether it has legal authority to review Elon Musk's Twitter deal, which gives large foreign investors access to confidential data. I don't know all of the details of the terms related to the financing of this deal. I'm sure there's some information about Twitter's performance as a business, which were shared or will be shared with those investors. But I'd be surprised if there's a lot there. It's the U.S. government's record thus far for making inroads in legislating the behavior of tech businesses, not strong. So this is a real wait and see aspect of the story. Time for another set. Eliza Lipsky-Karatz, Wall Street Journal. A profile of an interview with Jony Ive, covering life before and after Apple, his artistic process, love from, the importance of words, and more. If you want an example of the value of traditional media organizations, this is a good one. Someone as large and meaningful a public figure as Jony Ive is someone who can garner a lot of attention if you go and write an extensive profile and you offer that person a platform, which, let's be clear, that's exactly what's happening here. Jony Ive doesn't need press. He may want it. He may want his name to stay in the public conversation for whatever reasons, for unhealthy egomaniacal reasons, to love from becoming a, design agency for the next, 50 years, to reach the sort of echelon that, say, Pentagram or Chiat Day. Those are more traditional creative services agencies, but you get the point. Ultimately, this is all client services. So he's got a variety of reasons to want to do it, but the point is, doing it himself isn't as useful, arguably also not as effective. Had Jony hired a ghostwriter, hired photographers, and then authored an extensive profile about himself and his business and his feelings on the importance of words and everything else, where would he have published it? Maybe go write a biography, but that's a much different scale of endeavor. So you've got, call it 10,000 words or less. Where do you put that? You could take over a magazine, but something that I've been looking forward to reading and haven't made time for it yet. Bloomberg gave an entire issue of its magazine to Matt Levine to talk about crypto. And from what I understand, that's 40,000 words. That's a small book. Just if you make a magazine about one thing, that's kind of what a magazine becomes. So what I'm getting to here is there aren't a lot of places where you can put, roughly speaking, 10,000 word. Again, maybe it's not. Maybe it's 5,000 words. Maybe it's 2. Probably not 2. There aren't a lot of places to put that except the web. And so what would he do? He'd put it on lovefrom.com. You wouldn't get much traction there because lovefrom.com doesn't have a pre-existing relationship with millions of people. Wall Street Journal does. This is the value of an organization like the Wall Street Journal. It can bring user attention, the attention of human beings, to whatever story it is you want to tell. And depending on the type of story, telling it yourself doesn't make a lot of sense. So, I'm sure this profile of Jony will be interesting to many people. Maybe I'll get around to reading it at some point. Maybe not. Time for another set. Taylor Hatmaker, TechCrunch. Twitch launches Guest Star, which lets streamers pull other creators and fans into their streams for a talk show-like experience, out of beta for all users. Here you go. Here's some innovation. There's no way to tell just how wild the West can get on this particular front. Individuals having the ability to live stream to effectively everyone on Earth, at least anyone on Earth, whatever they want, that's a heavyweight tool, enabling those people to rope other users into that streamed experience and create interaction. I'd say that's an even heavier tool. Let's be clear, it's not that much different from what many people my age will recall as the sort of fundamental experience of Howard Stern or Rush Limbaugh. The difference is there can now be a million different Howard Sterns or Rush Limbaughs. I apologize for defaulting to male examples. I'm not especially familiar. Well, let's put it this way. If Oprah wanted to, reach that level, she absolutely could. But she doesn't. John Fingus Engadget. Google plans to roll out parental controls for Assistant, including disabling features, restricting services, and setting downtime hours in the coming weeks. Yeah, we need that. We as parents need software which enables us to do our jobs as parents. I don't feel like saying a whole lot more else than that, but I hope it works. Jordan Novitt, CNBC. AMD reports Q3 revenue up 29% year over year to 5.57 billion versus 5.62 estimated. Net income down 93% year over year to 66 million, and client unit revenue down nearly 40% year over year due to weak PC sales. It's another chapter in the story computing devices as they are incarnated today, particularly ones which run traditional operating systems, which is to say desktops, laptop computers, very near the flat part of the S-curve. There's arguably not a whole lot more that can be done with those form factors, which will change the sales figures, because the use cases for arguably the majority of people who purchase them are fixed and can be addressed with the hardware that exists in the market today. So yeah, so like generated 40% less revenue in the unit of the business which sells chips to manufacturers of those traditional computing devices. Raksha Kumar, Rest of World. A look at the everyday sexism faced by Indian women working in tech. Around 36% of India's 5 million tech workers are women, of which only 7% hold executive level positions. There's no doubt that there's veracity to this story and that it's something worth investigating, because equality of opportunity is a goal all of us should be striving for. But it's unclear, at least from this headline, whether this is a global phenomenon amongst Indian women. Is it Indian women in India? Is it Indian women in the United States? There are too many other variables, and quite frankly, I don't need to speculate on the cause. The point is, we all need to do better. Ewan Callaway, Nature. Meta researchers create ESM fold, an LLM, to predict the structures of over 617 million metagenomic proteins that is less accurate than DeepMind's AlphaFold, but 60% faster. I'm unfamiliar with what a metagenomic protein is. I'll simply say that it's a good thing that these businesses which produce incredible sums of money are investing some of that money into what I will assume is, again in very broad terms, a SETI at home for improving health outcomes in human beings. Maybe that's what metagenomic protein research is. Maybe it's not. But good on you. Keep exploring. But for now, that's all I have to say.